The night my parents locked the door behind me, the temperature dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. I remember because my phone battery died just as I checked the weather, standing on the front steps with one child on my hip and the other crying in a stroller that had a broken wheel. Snow was starting to fall, slow and quiet. The kind that looks beautiful if you're warm inside. I wasn't. If you've ever been pushed out of your own family with no warning, no backup plan, no mercy, you already know what that silence feels like. If you haven't, stay with me. Like the video, leave a comment about where you're listening from, and subscribe. Not because this is entertaining, because stories like this happen more often than people admit. My name is Eleanor Hart. I was 28 that night. I had 2 children, Noah Hart, 3 years old, asleep against my shoulder, and Lily Hart, just past 1 year, red-faced and screaming because she could feel my panic even if she didn't understand it. The man who shut the door was my father, Richard Hart. He didn't slam it. He closed it carefully, the way you do when you're sure you're right. My mother, Susan Hart, stood behind him in the hallway. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't look at the kids. Her eyes stayed on the floor, as if avoiding my face would make this cleaner. And my older sister, Margaret Hart, watched from the stairs with her arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line that said relief, not regret. "This is what happens when you make irresponsible choices," Richard had said moments earlier. "You're not bringing that chaos into this house." That chaos was my children. The reason was simple and ugly. I was a single mother. The father was gone. I had no ring, no husband, no story my parents could tell at church without lowering their voices. Margaret was married, stable, acceptable. I was an embarrassment, with a talent they never respected. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I asked one question. "Can I stay until morning? It's freezing." Susan finally looked up then. Her voice was quiet, controlled. "You should have thought about that earlier." That was the moment I understood something permanent had broken. 5 years before that night, I had been the invisible one, the younger daughter, the creative one, the one whose sketchbooks were treated like hobbies, while Margaret's accounting degree was treated like proof of worth. Design was what I did. Not fashion sketches for fun, not Pinterest boards. I designed interiors, textiles, spatial layouts. I could look at an empty room and see how light, texture, and movement would change the way people felt inside it. At 23, I'd been accepted into a competitive design program in Chicago. My parents refused to help. Margaret got her tuition covered. I took loans. I worked nights. I graduated with honors anyway. That should have mattered. It didn't. When I became pregnant the first time, Susan cried. Not because she was worried about me, because she was worried about what people would say. When I became pregnant the second time, Margaret stopped speaking to me entirely. By the time I moved back home with 2 kids in a suitcase, I already knew I was tolerated, not welcome. But I didn't expect exile. Standing on that porch, I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. I strapped Noah into the stroller beside Lily, wrapped them both in the thickest coats I had, and walked. No destination, just movement. We ended up at a 24-hour diner 3 blocks away. The waitress, a woman named Carla Bennett, took one look at us and brought hot chocolate without asking. She didn't ask questions. She didn't pity me. She treated us like people who belonged somewhere. That mattered more than she knew. I slept sitting upright in a booth that night. One arm around Noah, one foot hooked through the stroller so it wouldn't roll. When the sun came up, I had $19 left in my wallet and a decision to make. I could disappear, or I could build something so solid they'd have to look at it. The first year was survival. I rented a 1-bedroom basement apartment in Milwaukee because it was cheap and close to a community center that offered childcare. I worked mornings cleaning offices and nights waiting tables. During naps, I designed. Not dream projects, real ones. I redesigned small spaces for people who couldn't afford firms. A nail salon, a daycare lobby, a dentist's waiting room. I charged less than I should have and delivered more than I promised. My name started circulating quietly. Eleanor Hart. She sees things others don't. At 30, I landed a contract with a regional co-working company. They needed someone to reimagine underperforming locations. I didn't just redesign. I increased foot traffic by 27%. Numbers speak when families don't listen. By the time Noah started kindergarten, I was running my own studio out of a shared office space. 3 employees, 1 assistant. Revenue? Just over $400,000 a year. Margaret sent me a text then. Mom wants to know if you're still mad. I didn't respond, because this wasn't about anger anymore. It was about return. 5 years after that winter night, I received an invitation, a formal one. My parents were hosting a holiday charity gala at their house. Margaret was on the planning committee. The event supported local arts initiatives. My name was printed on the envelope. Eleanor Hart, principal designer, Heartline Studio. They wanted me there. Not because I was family, because I was useful. I RSVP'd, yes. Not because I missed them. Because some doors deserve to be reopened slowly. And some reckonings need an audience. The invitation sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I opened it again. Cream cardstock, embossed lettering. My parents' address, printed like nothing had ever happened, on that porch 5 winters ago. Like my children hadn't cried themselves to sleep in a stranger's booth because their grandparents decided blood had conditions. Noah was 8 now. Lily had just turned 6. They were doing homework at the table while I made pasta, arguing softly about whose turn it was to sharpen the pencils. They didn't know that house. They didn't know Richard Hart's voice or Susan Hart's silences. That was deliberate. Mom, Noah said, glancing up. Why are you staring at that paper? It's an invitation, I said. To where? Lily asked. A party, I replied. Are we going? Noah asked. I shook my head. No, I'm going alone. That was the first boundary. Quiet. Clean. The days leading up to the gala brought back memories I didn't invite. The way my parents used to praise Margaret in public and correct me in private. The way Susan would say things like, "You're talented, Eleanor, but talent doesn't pay bills," while Richard nodded, as if agreement made it truth. Margaret had always been the example. The good daughter. Married at 26, 2 cars, predictable holidays. She followed the script and was rewarded for it. I wrote my own, and was punished. 5 years hadn't softened that reality. They had simply changed who needed whom. The gala was held on a Saturday in December. Snow again, not as brutal this time. I dressed carefully, not to impress, to signal. Black tailored coat, simple dress, no statement jewelry. My hair pulled back cleanly. I didn't want to look expensive. I wanted to look precise. When I pulled up to the house, the driveway was full. Valet service. String lights along the hedges, music drifting through the windows. The same front door. A different Eleanor. Susan answered it. She froze for half a second. Enough for me to see surprise slip through the practiced smile. "Eleanor," she said. "You came." "Yes," I replied. She leaned in to hug me. I stepped back slightly. Not rude. Clear. Inside, nothing had changed. Same furniture, same photos on the wall. Margaret's wedding portrait still framed prominently. No photos of my children, of course. Margaret approached with a glass of wine, scanning me head to toe. "You look well," she said. "So do you," I replied. It wasn't true. She looked tired, tight around the eyes. The kind of exhaustion that comes from maintaining appearances without control. The room filled quickly. Donors, board members, people I recognized from industry events. A few turned when they heard my name. "Eleanor Hart," someone said behind me. "Heartline Studio?" I turned. A woman in her 50s, confident posture. "Yes, I'm Dana Wilcox," she said. "I sit on the Arts Development Council. We've been hearing about your work." Margaret stiffened beside me. "Oh, Eleanor designs interiors," she said quickly. She's always been artistic. Dana Wilcox smiled politely. "Design isn't just art, it's strategy." I met her eyes. That's how I see it too. The conversation moved on, but something shifted. People asked questions, real ones, about my firm, about my projects, about how I balanced work and family. I answered calmly, factually. Susan watched from across the room, her face unreadable. Richard joined us later, holding a drink he barely touched. "You've done well for yourself," he said. "Yes," I replied. "No, thank you." No acknowledgement of what it cost. "You could have done this sooner if you'd listened to us," he added. I looked at him then. Truly looked. "I did this because I stopped listening," I said. Silence settled between us. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Margaret laughed nervously. "Dad means you always had potential." "Potential doesn't keep children warm," I said. That landed. The charity presentation began shortly after. Margaret took the stage, confident, rehearsed. She spoke about community, about supporting the arts, about how creativity needed structure to thrive. Then she said my name. "We're honored tonight to have Eleanor Hart with us," she said. "A successful designer who proves that family values and hard work lead to success." I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, ownership. I stood when invited. Applause followed. Polite, curious. I didn't smile. "Thank you," I said into the microphone. "I appreciate the support for the arts." I paused. Not dramatically, intentionally. "I started my career without support," I continued. "No safety net, no backing. Just skill, responsibility, and 2 children who depended on me." The room was quiet now. "I believe in this cause because I know what it means to create without permission," I said, "and to build without applause." I handed the microphone back. Margaret's face was pale. Afterward, Susan approached me near the coat closet. "You didn't have to say all that," she whispered. "Yes," I replied. "I did." Richard didn't speak to me again that night. As I was leaving, Dana Wilcox caught up to me. "We're forming a new advisory board," she said, "for a state-funded design initiative. We need people who understand resilience." "I'd consider it," I said. When I stepped outside, the cold hit my face. Sharp. Clean. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. The invitation hadn't been reconciliation. It had been reconnaissance. They wanted access. Credibility. My name. What they didn't realize was that by calling me back into that house, they had reminded everyone why I left. And next time, the audience would be bigger, much bigger. The phone calls started 2 days after the gala. Not from my parents, not from Margaret, from people who had watched. Dana Wilcox emailed first, formal and brief, asking if I could meet to discuss the advisory board she'd mentioned. Then a developer from Madison reached out about a mixed-use project. Then a nonprofit director I didn't know forwarded a recommendation that had my name circled in red ink. Visibility is rarely an accident. It's usually the byproduct of someone else miscalculating the room. I met Dana Wilcox at a downtown cafe the following week. She arrived early, already seated, her coat folded neatly beside her. "You handled that room well," she said after we ordered. "You didn't attack, you clarified." "I didn't come to perform," I replied. "I came to be accurate." She smiled. "That's what makes people uncomfortable." She explained the initiative. A state-funded redevelopment program focused on underserved neighborhoods. Libraries, community centers, adaptive reuse projects. The kind of work that demanded restraint more than ego. "We've had designers walk away because it's not glamorous," she said. "We need someone who understands impact without applause." "I understand constraints," I replied, "and responsibility." She nodded. "That's why I'm asking." I agreed to consult. Not because of prestige, because the work aligned with the version of myself I trusted. When I returned to the office, my assistant, Maya Rodriguez, handed me a message slip. "Your sister called," she said, watching my face carefully. I didn't put it through. "Thank you," I replied. Margaret left a voicemail later, anyway. "You embarrassed Mom," she said. No greeting, no concern. People were asking questions. That wasn't necessary. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the message to my attorney, James Holloway, a calm man who never wasted words. "Document everything," he said when I called. "You're entering a space where narratives matter." "I'm not suing my family," I replied. "I know," he said, "but boundaries should be recorded." That night, Noah asked me why Grandma hadn't called since the party. "She doesn't know how," I said. "Does she miss us?" Lily asked. I paused. "She misses the idea of us," I replied. "That's different." They accepted that without pushing. Children understand distance when it's honest. 2 weeks later, the advisory board meeting took place in Madison. Long table, 12 members, government liaisons, community reps, people who spoke carefully because words carried consequences here. I was introduced by title, not relation. Eleanor Hart, founder and principal designer, Heartline Studio. That mattered. We reviewed proposals, budgets, impact assessments. I asked questions others avoided, about maintenance funding, about local hiring, about what happened after ribbon cuttings. After the meeting, a man named Thomas Keller approached me. Late 40s, clean suit, sharp eyes. My firm represents several municipalities, he said. We're restructuring a historic courthouse in Rockford. Your name came up. From whom? I asked. From someone who watched you decline a donation opportunity at your own family's gala, he said. That told me something. What did it tell you? I asked. That you don't confuse leverage with loyalty, he replied. I took the contract. Back home, Margaret escalated. She showed up at my office unannounced one afternoon, standing in the reception area like she owned the place. This is ridiculous, she said once we were alone. You could have just talked to us. I did, I replied. For years. You weren't listening. She crossed her arms. Mom is having trouble sleeping. I looked at her evenly. So did my children. On a winter night. Do you remember that? She flinched. That was different, she said quickly. No, I replied. It wasn't. She leaned forward. You're acting like you're better than us. I'm acting like I'm done asking permission, I said. Her voice dropped. Dad says you're letting success go to your head. I smiled faintly. Dad locked the door when I asked for warmth. She stared at me, searching for something she could use. Finding nothing. You think this ends well? She asked. I think this ends honestly, I replied. That evening, Susan emailed me for the first time in years. I worry that bitterness is changing you. I read it once, then deleted it, because bitterness demands attention. I wasn't giving them any more. Weeks passed. Projects stacked. My firm grew to 12 employees. Revenue crossed 7 figures, quietly, without celebration. Then came the letter, registered mail, from my parents' address. Inside was a formal notice. They were revising their estate plan. Margaret would remain executor. Certain assets would be redistributed. There was language about moral responsibility, family values, consequences. My name appeared once as a beneficiary removed, not because I needed it, but because they wanted to hurt me one last time. I handed the letter to James Holloway the next morning. They're baiting you, he said. I know, I replied. Do you want to contest? He asked. No, I said. I want to attend. He raised an eyebrow. Attend what? The reading, I replied. When the time comes. I walked back to my office, closed the door, and stood by the window. They thought inheritance was leverage. They thought exclusion was punishment. What they didn't understand was that by formalizing their rejection, they had given me something clean, proof. And when the right moment arrived, proof would matter more than money, much more. Because the next gathering wouldn't be a party, it would be a reckoning. And this time, they wouldn't control the room. The letter changed nothing in my day-to-day life. That was the part my parents didn't anticipate. I still woke up at 6. Packed lunches, reviewed drawings while the kids ate cereal, dropped Noah at school, Lily at daycare, then drove to the studio where 12 people waited for decisions that actually mattered. But something shifted underneath. Not anger. Alignment. When people weaponize inheritance, they assume you're still measuring your worth in what they control. Once you're not, their leverage becomes documentation. James Holloway advised me to stay quiet. Let them keep talking, he said. People who believe they hold power tend to over-explain. He was right. Margaret started calling mutual relatives, framing the story carefully. Eleanor is successful now, but she's changed. She's distant, cold. She's punishing our parents. The irony wasn't lost on me. I didn't correct the narrative. I let it travel. Because narratives gain weight as they move, and distortions eventually expose themselves. The advisory board work expanded quickly. I was asked to lead a subcommittee reviewing grant allocations, public funds, transparent processes, every decision documented. At the first meeting, a representative asked why I was so meticulous. Because I know what happens when systems favor the loudest voice, I replied. And I refuse to build one that does. The room went quiet. Then someone nodded. That's how trust forms. Not through charm, through consistency. At home, Noah started asking questions. Why don't we see Grandma and Grandpa? he asked one night while I tucked him in. Because sometimes adults choose comfort over responsibility, I said. And that's not something I want you to learn from. He thought about that. Is that why we don't lie? Yes, I replied. Lily asked a simpler question the next morning. Are we safe now? She said, chewing toast. Yes, I said without hesitation. We are. That was the truth I'd worked for. Margaret's next move came disguised as concern. She emailed asking if we could meet for coffee. Just us. No parents. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Public place. Midday. She arrived late, flustered, phone buzzing with messages she ignored. You look tired, I said. She smiled tightly. You look settled. We ordered. Saturday. I don't understand why you're doing this, she said finally. Doing what? I asked. Keeping distance, she said. Acting like we're strangers. We are, I replied calmly. You watched our parents lock us out, she winced. That wasn't my decision. You didn't stop it, I said. She leaned forward. You could have come back, apologized, asked for help. I met her eyes. I did ask for help. I asked for one night of warmth. She looked away. They're scared of you now, she said. That's not my responsibility, I replied. She lowered her voice. They think you're going to make them look bad. I smiled faintly. I don't need to do anything for that. Her jaw tightened. So that's it? You're just going to erase us? No, I said. I'm going to live without you. There's a difference. She stood abruptly. You think success makes you untouchable. I think integrity makes me uninterested, I replied. She left without finishing her coffee. 2 weeks later, the local paper ran a piece on the advisory board's first funded project, a renovated community arts center in a district long ignored by city planners. My name was quoted once. About accountability. Susan called the next morning. Her voice was small. We're proud of you. I closed my eyes. I don't need pride, I said. I needed protection. She started to cry. Quietly. You're being unfair. No, I replied. I'm being accurate. She hung up. The estate letter resurfaced again. This time, indirectly. A cousin mentioned it at a family gathering I didn't attend. The story had shifted. Eleanor was cut out because she chose money over family, because she refused reconciliation, because she was vindictive. James forwarded me a copy of the revised will when it was filed. Clean, legal, intentional. I signed a document acknowledging receipt, not contesting, not protesting, accepting. Because acceptance doesn't always mean agreement. Sometimes it means preparation. The following month, I received an unexpected invitation. A winter benefit hosted by the State Design Council. Large audience, media presence. Margaret's firm was listed as a sponsor, and my studio was shortlisted for a statewide award. Same room, different balance of power. I didn't tell my parents I was attending. I didn't tell Margaret either. When the night came, I walked in with my head up, my phone off, my focus narrow. People turned, recognized me, approached. Margaret spotted me from across the room, her face drained of color. Susan froze near the coat check. Richard stiffened beside a donor he'd been trying to impress. For a moment, no one moved. Then the program began. Awards were announced. Applause. Smiles. When my name was called, it was clean, professional, apolitical. Eleanor Hart. For outstanding contributions to equitable design and community redevelopment. I stood, accepted, thanked the team. Then I said one sentence that I'd rehearsed carefully. This work exists because I learned early what happens when doors close and how to build spaces no one can be locked out of. I didn't look at them. I didn't have to. The room understood. Afterward, donors approached. Council members asked questions. Journalists scribbled notes. My parents left early. Margaret stayed, trapped between obligation and humiliation. As I stepped outside into the cold night air, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not revenge. Resolution. Because this wasn't about inheritance anymore. It wasn't about apology. It was about authorship. I was writing the narrative now. And the next chapter wouldn't be about proving what they'd lost. It would be about deciding what access they would never regain. The morning after the benefit, my inbox was full. Not congratulations. Requests. Developers asking for availability. Nonprofits asking for collaboration. a university asking if I would consider a guest lecture on ethical design systems. Visibility has a cost. It invites people to project their needs onto you. I answered selectively. That afternoon, James Holloway called. "They've filed an amendment," he said. "Who?" I asked. "Your parents," he replied. "They added a clause." I closed my office door and sat. "What kind of clause?" I asked. "A family business restriction," he said. "Any beneficiary who publicly damages the family's reputation forfeits future consideration." I exhaled slowly. "They're trying to intimidate me." "Yes," he said, "and document it." "Is it enforceable?" I asked. "In theory," he replied. "In practice, it's vague, but it signals intent." Intent mattered. "Do nothing," James continued. "Let them keep escalating." That evening, Margaret texted, "You didn't have to say that line." I didn't reply. The next escalation didn't come from my parents. It came from a client. A mid-size retail brand pulled out of a contract 2 weeks before kickoff. No explanation, just a polite email citing internal changes. Maya flagged it immediately. "This is unusual," she said. They were enthusiastic. I made one call, then another. By the end of the day, the reason surfaced. Richard Hart had mentioned, casually, at a donor dinner, that my firm was politically complicated, that I had family issues that made some partnerships risky. He hadn't named me directly. He hadn't needed to. "That's defamation," James said when I told him. "It's influence," I replied. He knows how to whisper. "Do you want to respond?" James asked. "Yes," I said, but not emotionally. We drafted a letter, not to my parents, to the client. It clarified scope, values, governance, independence, no accusations, no drama. The client reinstated the contract within 48 hours. Richard's tactic backfired quietly. I documented everything. Dates, names, consequences. Because when people use soft power, they underestimate paper trails. At home, no one noticed I was quieter. "Are they bothering you again?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He thought about it. "They're not very good at it." I smiled. "You're right." That weekend, Susan showed up at my building unannounced. I didn't let her in immediately. I looked at her through the glass first. She looked smaller, older. When I opened the door, she reached for Lily instinctively. Lily stepped back behind my leg. That stopped her. "We need to talk," Susan said. "I don't do ambushes," I replied. "Say what you came to say." Her eyes filled. "Your father is scared." "Of what?" I asked. "Of losing standing," she said. "Of being judged." I nodded. "That's how power feels when it's conditional." She swallowed. "He didn't mean to hurt your work. He meant to control it," I replied. She looked around my apartment. The clean lines, the art, the calm. "You've built a life," she said softly. "Yes," I replied. "One you chose not to protect." Her face tightened. "We did what we thought was right." "No," I said. "You did what was comfortable." She flinched. "I don't want us to be enemies," she said. "We're not," I replied. "We're strangers with history." She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a check. 5 figures. "For the kids," she said quickly. "For their future." I pushed it back toward her. "They already have one," I said. She stared at the envelope like it was suddenly heavier. "I don't want money," I continued. "I want distance." That hurt her more than anger ever could. She left without another word. The following week, the State Design Council announced the next phase of funding. I was appointed lead reviewer. Public role. Transparent authority. Margaret's firm applied. I recused myself immediately. Filed the paperwork. Declared conflict. The council appreciated it. Margaret did not. She called that night, voice shaking. "You're freezing us out," she said. "No," I replied. "I'm following protocol." "You're enjoying this," she accused. "I'm protecting what I built," I said. There was a pause. Then, quietly, "You're not coming back, are you?" I considered the question. "No," I said. "I already arrived." She hung up. As I tucked the kids into bed that night, I realized something important. They were watching how I handled power, not how I took revenge, not how I demanded apology, how I enforced boundaries without cruelty. That was a real inheritance. And the next chapter wouldn't be about retaliation. It would be about consequence. Because systems don't collapse when challenged. They collapse when exposed. And my family had just begun to understand the difference. The exposure didn't arrive as a confrontation. It arrived as paperwork. The council required disclosure statements from all applicants in the next funding round. Not new, not personal, just thorough. Financial ties, governance structures, prior conflicts. Transparency that most firms treated like a nuisance. I treated it like a mirror. Margaret's firm submitted theirs late. Dana Wilcox called me that afternoon. "Have you reviewed the disclosures yet?" she asked. "Only at a high level," I replied. "Why?" "There are inconsistencies," she said. "Nothing illegal, but enough to raise questions." I didn't ask whose. She continued, "I wanted you to know before the review committee meets. You're recused, but your name is attached to process integrity. Optics matter. So does accuracy," I replied. "That's why I'm calling," she said. I forwarded the note to James Holloway. He responded within minutes. "This is where restraint pays off. Let the system do what it's designed to do." The review meeting happened without me. I stayed in my office, worked through drawings for a municipal library project, and refused to check my phone. When Dana called later, her tone was measured. "They've requested additional documentation from Margaret's firm," she said, "related to vendor relationships and past representations." "And?" I asked. "And she's not handling it well," Dana replied. That tracked. Margaret had always believed proximity replaced preparation. That night, my father called, for the first time since the benefit. I let it ring. Then, voicemail. "Eleanor," Richard said, his voice tight. "We need to talk. This situation is getting out of hand." Out of hand meant out of his control. I didn't respond. 2 days later, a reporter reached out, not for a profile, for clarification. They were writing about the new funding framework and wanted comment from the advisory board lead on ethical recusal and governance. I agreed to speak on record, not about my family, about principles. I said exactly what I believe. That transparency protects institutions from favoritism. That recusal isn't punishment, it's professionalism. That personal discomfort is not the same as injustice. The article ran online that evening. Margaret's firm was not named, but the timing was obvious. Susan called again, this time angry. "You're humiliating your sister," she said. "I'm not involved in her application," I replied. "You're influencing the narrative," she insisted. "I'm describing a system," I said. "If it exposes weakness, that's not influence." There was a long pause. "Your grandmother would be ashamed," she said. I inhaled slowly. "Don't speak for people who protected me when you wouldn't." That ended the call. The next escalation came quietly. A letter from the council. Margaret's firm had been disqualified from the current funding cycle due to incomplete disclosures. Not banned, delayed. A procedural consequence. Margaret showed up at my office the next morning. Not loud, not dramatic, just hollow. "You could have warned me," she said. "I did," I replied, "by recusing myself." She laughed once. Sharp. "You always do things indirectly." "No," I said. "I do them correctly." She sat down, without asking. "They're blaming me," she said. "Dad says this never would have happened if you hadn't made everything public." I met her eyes. "This happened because your firm couldn't withstand scrutiny," I said. "That's not my fault." Her voice cracked. "Do you know what it's like to be judged by people who don't know you?" "Yes," I replied. "I was expelled from my family for 5 years." She flinched. "I thought you'd be satisfied by now," she said quietly. I leaned back. "Satisfied with what?" "With watching us struggle," she said. "I'm not watching," I replied. "I'm building." She looked around my office, the staff moving calmly beyond the glass, the children's drawings pinned discreetly near my desk. "You always wanted this," she said. "I wanted safety," I replied. "This is the result." She stood slowly. "You won," she said. I shook my head. This was never a game. She left without another word. That evening, Noah asked why Aunt Margaret hadn't come to his birthday last year. "She wasn't ready," I said. "Will she ever be?" he asked. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "That's up to her." The following week, the council announced a new compliance training requirement for all applicants. Margaret's firm enrolled. Too late for this round. In the same week, Heartline Studio was awarded a contract to redesign a historic courthouse annex. Public, prestigious, demanding. When I told the kids, Lily clapped. "Does that mean you're famous?" she asked. "No," I said. "It means I'm trusted." That night, as I reviewed documents at home, an email came in from Susan. "We never meant to lose you. I stared at the sentence. Intent doesn't undo impact. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened a new folder on my computer. Family communications. I saved everything. Not to weaponize. To remember. Because memory, without record, gets rewritten. And I was done letting anyone revise my story. The reckoning was no longer emotional. It was administrative. And that was the most unforgiving kind. Because systems don't care who you love. They care what you prove. And the next chapter would test whether my family understood that difference before the final door closed for good. The courthouse project changed how people spoke to me. Not warmer, not colder, more carefully. Public money does that. It sharpens tone. It makes everyone aware that words create records, and records outlive intention. I didn't take that lightly. I took it personally. The way you do when you've learned what happens without documentation. Heartline Studio expanded again. 17 employees, 2 interns from the state university, a project manager whose only weakness was apologizing too often for asking necessary questions. I corrected that. Clarity is not aggression, I told her. Say what you need the first time. At home, routines held. Homework at 4, dinner at 6, stories at 8. The children were growing into themselves without knowing what they'd been spared. That was success. The reckoning I expected didn't come from my parents next. It came from the past. A woman named Clara Jensen emailed the studio asking for a consultation. Her name didn't register until she added context. She had been my mother's closest friend for 30 years, the one who brought casseroles after Margaret's wedding, the one who'd watched me be quietly erased at family gatherings. I hesitated before replying. Then I agreed. We met in a neutral space, a quiet tea room near the river. She looked older than I remembered. Softer. I owe you an apology, she said before sitting down. I waited. I should have said something that night, she continued. When they asked you to leave. I nodded once. Yes, you should have. She swallowed. I didn't want to interfere. Interference would have been protection, I replied. What you chose was comfort. She flinched, but didn't argue. They're unraveling, she said quietly. Your parents. Margaret, too. That's not my concern, I replied. It might be, she said. They're talking about selling the house. That caught my attention. Not emotionally, but strategically. Why? I asked. Debt, she said. The gala underperformed. Donations slowed. Richard invested in something he didn't understand. I said nothing. They assumed you'd help, Clara added. Eventually. I looked at her then. They never asked for help. They asked for obedience. She nodded. I see that now. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because they're framing it as your fault, she said. They're telling people you turned on them. I smiled faintly. Of course they are. She leaned forward. I don't believe that. That's kind, I replied. But belief isn't leverage. We parted politely. She looked relieved. I felt nothing. 2 weeks later, the invitation arrived. Thanksgiving, at the house. Susan's handwriting on the envelope. Careful. Hopeful. Inside was a note. We are still a family. We should talk. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I asked Noah and Lily what Thanksgiving meant to them. Pumpkin pie, Lily said. Days off school, Noah added. And the parade. Would you want to go somewhere new this year? I asked. They nodded eagerly. Decision made. I replied to Susan with one sentence. We will not be attending. I wish you well. She called. I didn't answer. Richard left a voicemail. You're tearing this family apart, he said. I saved it. Margaret sent a message late that night. Dad's health isn't great. You don't want to regret this. I stared at the screen. Regret is the currency of people who confuse consequence with cruelty. I typed back. Do not use illness as leverage. She didn't reply. Thanksgiving came and went. We watched the parade, made pie, ate too much. The kids laughed. That night, after they fell asleep, I received a message from James Holloway. Your parents are listing the house. I sat quietly for a long time. Not because I wanted it, because they did. The house had always been a symbol. Stability. Authority. The place I was expelled from. Now, it was slipping. James followed up with a second message. They're asking if you'd consider purchasing it through a trust. Quietly. I closed my eyes. There it was. The reach. They didn't want reconciliation. They wanted relief. I called James. No, I said. Understood, he replied. They made their choice, I continued. I'm not their exit strategy. Then be prepared, he said. They'll escalate. I hung up. The escalation came fast. Susan showed up at my office again. This time, with Richard. They stood in the reception area like people who didn't recognize the place. I met them there. This is not appropriate, I said calmly. We need to talk, Richard insisted. No, I replied. You want to negotiate. Susan's eyes were red. We're drowning, I nodded. That happens when people build their lives on control. You owe us, Richard snapped. Everything you have started here. I looked at him evenly. I owe you nothing, I said. You chose distance when I asked for shelter. Margaret arrived minutes later, breathless, panicked. Please, she said, can we not do this here? This is where I work, I replied. You came uninvited. Susan reached for my arm. I stepped back. This ends now, I said. You don't get access to my life when it's convenient. Richard's voice rose. You think you're better than us. No, I replied. I think I'm done negotiating my worth. People were watching now. Staff, clients. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't apologize. I walked back into my office and closed the door. They left shortly after. That evening, Margaret sent one last message. If this is revenge, I hope it was worth it. I stared at it, then replied, This is not revenge. This is the result. I turned my phone off. The final stage wasn't loud. It was quiet withdrawal. They had lost access to my time, my platform, my resources. What remained was paperwork, pride, and the realization that systems don't bend for nostalgia. The next chapter wouldn't be about what they tried to take. It would be about what they could no longer touch. And once that boundary was fully understood, there would be nothing left to argue about, only silence. And silence, when chosen, is the most decisive answer of all. Silence changed the shape of everything. Without calls, without unexpected appearances, without the low-level tension of waiting for the next intrusion, my days became cleaner. Time stopped leaking. Energy returned to places I hadn't realized were starving. Heartline Studio entered a different phase. Not expansion, consolidation. We formalized governance, created a review board with rotating external advisors, instituted a profit-sharing structure tied to long-term project outcomes, not short-term wins. I wanted the firm to outlive my mood, my presence, even my ambition. That was the difference between control and stewardship. At home, the kids noticed the quiet too. Your phone doesn't buzz as much, Noah observed one evening. That's intentional, I said. Is it because you fixed the problem? Lily asked. I thought about that. I didn't fix people, I said. I fixed access. She nodded, satisfied. Children understand boundaries better than adults who benefit from crossing them. The house sale became public shortly after. A listing appeared online. My parents' address. Photographs I recognized. The living room where I'd once stood with my children, asking for one night of warmth. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not sadness. Completion. Margaret tried one more angle. She sent an email from her work account. Formal. Restrained. I'd like to meet with a mediator. For closure. I forwarded it to James Holloway. His response was immediate. Closure is not a legal term. It's a personal one. Decide if you want it. I sat with the question longer than I expected. Then I answered Margaret myself. I don't require closure. I require distance. Please respect that. She replied an hour later. Then I hope you're ready for what comes next. Threats wrapped in wounded pride always sound smaller than the sender intends. What came next wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. Richard filed a formal complaint with the advisory board, alleging conflict of interest, reputational harm, and undue influence. It was written carefully, emotion disguised as governance concern. The board notified me the same day. Dana Wilcox called. This is baseless, she said, but we'll review it properly. As you should, I replied. That mattered. I submitted my documentation. Every recusal, every disclosure, every timeline. No commentary. Facts don't require tone. 2 weeks later, the board dismissed the complaint unanimously. They issued a policy update, reinforcing recusal standards and discouraging personal grievances, framed as ethics concerns. Richard's name wasn't mentioned, but the message was unmistakable. That was the moment the power dynamic collapsed. Not publicly, not humiliatingly, irreversibly. Susan sent one final email. "I don't recognize our family anymore." I read it carefully, then typed back, "Neither do I. That is not a failure." I archived the thread. Winter deepened. Snow fell again. But this time, the house was warm, the pantry full, the children safe. On the anniversary of the night we were expelled, I didn't mark it aloud. I took the kids to the museum instead. We walked through exhibits on architecture, design, systems built to last. Noah lingered in a room about civic planning. "Mom," he said, "did you build these places?" "People like me did," I replied. He smiled. "I want to build things that don't fall down." "So do I said. That evening, a message arrived from Dana. "The council is recommending you as chair for the next term." I sat quietly for a long time. 5 years ago, I had been locked out in the cold. Now I was being asked to safeguard access for others. That symmetry mattered. I accepted. Not because it felt like victory, because it felt like responsibility returned to the right hands. The past no longer chased me. It couldn't keep up. And the future wasn't asking me to forgive, forget, or reconcile. It was asking me to decide how visible I wanted to be, and how firm my boundaries needed to remain. The next chapter would test that balance. Because when people lose control, they don't always retreat. Sometimes they try to rewrite the ending. And I was done being written into anyone else's version of events, especially theirs. The rewrite began quietly. It always does. A colleague forwarded me a link with a short note. "You should see this." It was an opinion piece on a local blog, not widely read, not credible enough to matter on its own, but familiar in tone. The kind of writing that pretends to ask questions while planting conclusions. It talked about unelected influence, about how advisory boards could be shaped by personal agendas, about family estrangement being a warning sign of poor judgment. No names, but enough breadcrumbs for anyone paying attention. I closed the tab without finishing it. The point wasn't the article. The point was the attempt. James Holloway called an hour later. "They're testing the perimeter," he said, "seeing what sticks." I expected that, I replied. "Do you want to respond?" he asked. "No," I said. "I want to proceed." Proceeding was the most disruptive choice. The courthouse project entered its public review phase that week. Town hall meetings, community feedback, recorded sessions, every decision exposed to scrutiny. I attended all of them, not to defend, to listen. When residents asked hard questions about accessibility, I answered with drawings and timelines. When critics questioned budget priorities, I walked them through the numbers. No defensiveness, no spin. Trust builds in repetition. Margaret's firm was absent. They'd lost momentum, lost confidence, lost the benefit of proximity they'd relied on for years. That showed. At home, the kids were thriving. Noah had joined a robotics club. Lily was obsessed with sketching floor plans on scrap paper, narrating imaginary rooms aloud. "This one is quiet," she said one afternoon, pointing to a corner. "It's for thinking." I watched her draw and felt something steady in my chest. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you normalize. Susan tried one last emotional angle. She mailed a box. Inside were old photographs, school drawings, a letter written in her careful cursive. "I was afraid. I didn't know how to protect you. I thought control was safety." I read it once, then placed it back in the box. Understanding doesn't obligate re-entry. I stored it in the closet. Not hidden, just not present. The real confrontation came unexpectedly, at a public forum. A question period had just ended when a man stood up near the back. Older, familiar posture. Richard. He hadn't announced himself. He hadn't requested time. He simply spoke. "I'd like to ask whether personal grievances have influenced this process," he said, "given recent family disputes involving the chair." The room stilled. I didn't look surprised. I looked prepared. "Sir," I said evenly, "please state your question clearly." He swallowed. "Have you used your position to punish those who disagreed with you?" I nodded once. "No." Murmurs rippled. Every decision I've participated in is documented, disclosed, and reviewed by independent parties, I continued. My personal relationships have been formally recused where applicable. That record is public. He shifted. But perception matters. Yes, I replied, which is why transparency exists. I paused. And I will not allow this forum to be used to resolve private conflicts. The moderator intervened, thanked him, moved on. Richard sat down slowly. The moment passed. But something irreversible had happened. He had tried to confront me in public and failed. After the meeting, Dana Wilcox approached me. "You handled that well," she said. "I handled it correctly," I replied. She nodded. "They're out of moves." That night, Margaret sent a message. "Dad embarrassed himself. Was that what you wanted?" I didn't answer immediately. Then I typed. "He chose the venue. I chose the boundary." She didn't reply. The blog article was quietly edited days later. The insinuations softened. The comments disabled. The house sold the following week, below asking. A practical loss, not symbolic. I felt a twinge then. Not grief, finality. James called with one last update. "They're dissolving some of the family trust structures," he said. "Simplifying." "They're retreating," I said. "Yes," he replied. "And they won't admit why." That was fine. I didn't need confession, only cessation. At the next advisory board meeting, I introduced a proposal, a policy ensuring protections for individuals excluded from family-backed networks. Grants prioritized for those without inherited capital. Transparency requirements strengthened. The vote passed unanimously. No one mentioned my story. They didn't need to. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with the kids, helping with homework. Noah looked up suddenly. "Mom," he said, "why do people get mad when rules apply to them?" I smiled slightly. "Because rules remove special treatment." He considered that. "I like rules," he said. "They're fair." "Yes," I replied. "They are." Later, after they slept, I stood by the window and watched snow fall again. 5 winters apart. Same cold. Different outcome. The people who once defined my limits were shrinking into background noise. Not villains. Not lessons. Context. The next chapter wouldn't be about them pushing back. It would be about what happens when there's nothing left to push against. When silence isn't imposed, but chosen. And when the final version of the story no longer requires their names at all. The absence of resistance was louder than any argument had been. Once my parents stopped calling. Once Margaret stopped posturing. Once the blog posts dried up and the side comments lost their audience. A strange thing happened. Nothing replaced them. No new antagonist stepped in. No fresh crisis demanded my attention. The work didn't suddenly get easier, but it became cleaner, predictable, governable. That was the cost of doing things properly. It removes drama as fuel. The council chair role required more travel, more oversight, less room for instinct. I learned to pause before decisions, not because I doubted myself, but because systems improve when you let others test them. At one meeting, a younger member asked why I insisted on documenting dissent. "Wouldn't it be easier to move on once we vote?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "But easier isn't safer." He nodded slowly, writing it down. That same week, Heartline Studio was shortlisted for a national award. Maya brought the email into my office like it was fragile. "Do we celebrate?" she asked. "We acknowledge," I replied. "Then we go back to work." She smiled. She was learning my language. At home, Noah was struggling with a school project. He needed to design a model city block using recycled materials. He spread cardboard and markers across the table, frustrated. "It doesn't fit," he said. "Everything crashes." I sat beside him. "What happens if you remove one thing?" He pulled out a piece. The structure settled. "Oh," he said. I watched his face change as he understood. That night, after the kids were asleep, I found myself thinking about my parents in a way I hadn't allowed before. Not as adversaries. As people who had made choices early and spent decades protecting them. I didn't feel pity. I felt distance. Distance allows clarity. A letter arrived from Margaret the following Monday. Not an email. Paper. Handwritten. She wrote about exhaustion, about therapy, about realizing how much of her identity had been built on being approved. She didn't ask to reconcile. She asked to be understood. I read it twice. Then I folded it and placed it in the same box as Susan's photographs. Not answered, not rejected, stored, because understanding doesn't always require response. The real shift came when the council requested I mentor 2 new advisory leads. Women in their early 30s. Brilliant, hesitant. Both from families who had questioned their ambition. They didn't ask about strategy. They asked about endurance. How do you keep going when it feels like success makes people angry? One asked. I answered honestly. You stop explaining, I said. You let consistency do the talking. It surprised me, too. I had spent years thinking the reckoning would be loud, public, vindicating. Instead, it had been administrative, procedural, and deeply personal in ways no audience could see. The final confirmation arrived, without ceremony. James called. They've closed the remaining trust accounts, he said. There's nothing left to contest. Or leverage. Good, I replied. You sound relieved, he said. I am, I replied. It means it's over. When I hung up, I realized something subtle but important. I hadn't won. Winning implies a shared battlefield. I had exited it. That evening, I cooked dinner, slowly. Let the kids help. Lily insisted on plating, arranging food with unnecessary care. This looks important, she said proudly. It is, I replied. We made it. After they went to bed, I opened my laptop and reviewed a proposal I'd been putting off. A foundation wanted to fund a long-term project focused on housing design for single-parent families displaced by family rejection. They wanted me to lead it. 5 years ago, the idea would have hurt. Now, it felt precise. I accepted. Not as a reaction, as a continuation. Before sleep, I stood in the doorway of the kids' room, watching them breathe evenly. They wouldn't remember the cold night. They wouldn't remember the diner booth or the panic. They would remember consistency, warmth, boundaries that held. That was the quietest form of revenge, not payback. Proof. Proof that exclusion doesn't define outcome. That control doesn't equal authority. That love, when conditional, loses its power the moment you stop negotiating for it. The final chapter wouldn't tie up loose ends, because there weren't any left. It would simply state what had already become true. I was no longer reacting to the past. I was designing the future, and no one else had a say in the blueprint anymore. The foundation work slowed me down in the best way, not physically, structurally. It forced me to revisit questions I hadn't needed to articulate before. What does safety look like when it's designed, not assumed? How do you build dignity into space when the people using it have been taught they don't deserve permanence? The first site visit was in a mid-sized city outside Cleveland, an old motel slated for conversion into transitional housing. Families like mine 5 years earlier, women with children, no margin, no tolerance for error. I walked the property with the project director, a woman named Andrea Mills. Practical, unsentimental. She'd been doing this work longer than I'd been an adult. We don't need beauty, she said, gesturing at the cracked asphalt. We need durability. You need both, I replied. One keeps people alive. The other keeps them from leaving when they stabilize. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. You've lived this. Yes, I said. And I won't design it like charity. That was the difference. Back home, the pace of my personal life stayed steady, predictable. The children didn't ask about my parents anymore. That door had quietly closed without ceremony. Then, Susan called. I almost didn't answer, but I did. Her voice was fragile, not dramatic, thin. Your father had a stroke, she said. I closed my eyes. When? I asked. 2 days ago, she replied. He's stable. But changed. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. She hesitated. Would you come? No, I replied gently, a sharp inhale on the other end. He keeps asking for you. I chose my words carefully. I'm not the person he wants, I said. He wants the version of me that asks for approval. Silence. I can't give him that, I continued, and visiting won't help him heal. Her voice broke. I don't know how we got here. I do, I replied. But knowing doesn't undo it. She didn't argue. I just wanted you to know, she said quietly. Thank you, I replied. We ended the call without hostility, without hope. That was new. Margaret didn't contact me. Not directly, but Clara Jensen did. They're unraveling, she said again, but differently this time. I'm not available for updates, I replied. I know, she said. I just thought you'd want to hear this. I didn't ask what it was. She told me anyway. Margaret had taken a leave of absence from her firm. Therapy. Reassessment. The house sale had gone through. They'd downsized. No villain monologue. No apology tour. Just contraction. That night, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because they were struggling, because the narrative had finally detached from me. At work, the foundation project gained momentum. Funding secured. Zoning approved. A prototype unit built. When I walked through the finished space for the first time, I stood still. Clean lines. Durable materials. Thoughtful storage. Warm light. Andrea watched me quietly. This would have mattered to you, she said. It did, I replied. She nodded. Then it will matter to them. That was the moment I understood the final shape of my story. It wasn't about returning. It was about redirecting. A few weeks later, the National Award ceremony took place. Heartline Studio won. I didn't attend. Maya went instead. She sent me a photo of the plaque sitting on my desk when she returned. I smiled, put it in a drawer. At home, Noah asked me a question that stopped me cold. Mom, he said, do you ever miss being someone else? I thought about the porch, the cold, the door closing. No, I replied. I miss nothing about who I used to need to be. He nodded, satisfied. The letter came 2 days later. From Margaret. Short. Careful. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I see now what I refused to see then. I sat with it for a long time. Then I wrote back. I'm glad you're seeing clearly. That work is yours to continue. I wish you steadiness. Nothing more. Nothing less. I mailed it and didn't think about it again. As winter turned toward spring, the foundation announced its first housing opening date. Families were selected. Move-ins scheduled. On the day the first mother received her keys, she cried. I didn't. I watched, because sometimes the most profound moments aren't yours to perform. They're yours to protect. That night, as I tucked the kids in, Lily asked me to tell her a story. About what? I asked. About building, she said. But the kind where nothing breaks. I smiled. And I told her, one. The final chapter wouldn't bring closure. Closure suggests something ended. What had happened to me hadn't ended. It had transformed. And the transformation didn't belong to my parents, my sister, or the house they lost. It belonged to the future I was actively shaping. Quietly, deliberately. On my terms. The last chapter would say that out loud, once, and then let it stand. The morning the first families moved in, I arrived early, not to supervise, not to speak, just to be present before the noise began. The building was still quiet. The hallways smelled like fresh paint and clean air. Sunlight came in through windows that had been placed intentionally, not for beauty alone, but for orientation. So people could wake up knowing where they were. Knowing matters. Andrea Mills met me by the entrance, coffee in hand. You didn't have to come this early, she said. I wanted to see it before it filled up, I replied. She nodded. That makes sense. By noon, cars arrived. Minivans, ride shares. One woman came on foot, holding a toddler and dragging a suitcase that had lost a wheel. I noticed because I'd been that woman. She signed paperwork, accepted keys, stood frozen in the doorway of her unit, like she didn't trust the floor to hold her yet. I didn't introduce myself. I didn't need to. This wasn't about recognition. It was about outcome. That afternoon, I drove home slowly, windows down, radio off. The city looked ordinary, and that was the point. Safety shouldn't feel remarkable. At home, Noah and Lily were waiting, with their backpacks half unzipped, homework spread across the table. Did it open? Lily asked. Yes, I said. Did it work? Noah asked. Yes, I said, again. They nodded, satisfied, and went back to arguing about whose turn it was to erase the whiteboard. Later that night, after they were asleep, I sat alone in the living room and let myself do something I hadn't done in years. I looked back, not to relive, to inventory. The night on the porch, the diner booth, the first sketch done with one hand while holding a baby with the other. The silence from my parents, the certainty from my sister that she would always be chosen. The years of proving things to people who had already decided I wasn't worth the risk. And then the moment I stopped explaining, stopped seeking permission, stopped mistaking proximity for love. Everything that followed had grown from that decision. Not fame, not revenge. Alignment. My phone buzzed once. A message from an unknown number. It was Susan. He's asking less now. I think he knows you won't come. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I replied with the only truth that didn't reopen anything. I hope he finds peace. She didn't answer, and that was fine. The next week, I stood in front of a group of architecture students at a small university. No cameras, no press, just notebooks and tired eyes. They asked about success. I talked about systems. They asked about failure. I talked about isolation. One student raised her hand near the end. What do you do when the people who should support you don't? She asked. I didn't answer quickly. You build anyway, I said. But you build differently, with exits, with backups, with standards that don't depend on approval. She nodded, writing furiously. When I got home, I found a drawing taped to my door. Lily had drawn a house, big windows, thick walls, 3 figures inside. This one doesn't lock people out, she said proudly. I crouched to her level. It's perfect. That night, I packed away the box. The photos, the letters, the remnants of a family that only worked when I made myself smaller. I didn't destroy it. I didn't ritualize it. I stored it where it belonged, in the past. On the anniversary of the night we were forced out, I didn't mark it with silence or grief. I took the kids out for breakfast. We ordered pancakes. Too many. We laughed. And when we walked outside, the air was cold, but not punishing. Winter had lost its teeth. I don't believe in neat endings. Life doesn't offer them. But I believe in thresholds, moments where you step from one reality into another and don't look back because the ground beneath you finally feels solid. I didn't forgive my parents. I didn't reconcile with my sister. I didn't reclaim a house or a name or a role that never protected me. What I reclaimed was authorship over my work, my children, my time, my future. And that has been enough. If you've listened this far, you already know why this story matters. Not because of betrayal, but because of what happens after you stop negotiating your worth with people who benefit from your doubt. If this resonated with you, like the video. It helps stories like this reach the people who need them. If you've lived something similar, share it in the comments. Not for validation, for record. And if you want more real stories about family drama, betrayal, quiet revenge, and choosing yourself without apology, subscribe. Some doors close in winter. Others are built afterward, warmer, stronger, and with locks you control.